From an island in the North Atlantic, the United Kingdom extended its flag over a quarter of the planet. For centuries, the British Empire shaped borders, imposed laws, and displaced peoples from the coasts of America to the jungles of Southeast Asia. What began as isolated ventures of merchants and adventurers ended up being an imperial system with political, military, and financial networks that marked modern history. Its expansion was not constant. It advanced, retreated, and reconfigured itself with every war, treaty, or rebellion. It changed the peoples it dominated, but it also transformed the British Isles from within. Today, its legacy survives in legal systems, open conflicts, and colonial memories. How did such a small nation manage to build such a vast empire? From the English coast to the Caribbean, the first phase of the empire. At the beginning of the 16th century, English merchants began to look towards the Atlantic in search of new routes that would allow them to access markets that other Europeans were already exploiting. Although Portugal and Spain dominated the sea lanes, interests were activated in London that saw the sea as a direct route to economic growth. Navigators like John Cabot appeared, whose expeditions to Newfoundland did not generate permanent settlements, but did awaken interest in areas that were not yet under Catholic control. The first decades did not offer clear benefits, but they marked the beginning of a long process of expansion that combined trade, religion, and political control. In that stage, the initiatives were private and lacked systematic support from the state, but they represented a germinal vision of an empire beyond the continent. Towards the middle of the 16th century, British attempts to access routes to Asia without passing through Iberian-controlled territories intensified. Companies such as the Muscovy Company appeared, which attempted to trade through the Arctic with Muscovy and Persia. Although limited in impact, they showed a different strategy, circumventing obstacles through alternative alliances. In parallel, trade opened up with the Levant and West Africa, where contacts emerged that soon led to networks of slavery and human transport. These initial incursions formed the basis of a commercial logic that would later structure the entire colonial apparatus. Piracy also began to form part of the English repertoire, with figures like Hawkins and Drake operating in the Caribbean, looting galleons and challenging the Spanish monopoly. In the last third of the 16th century, the first ideas of effective colonization began to consolidate. Walter Raleigh's projects in Virginia, although they initially failed, introduced the concept of agricultural settlement under British control. In 1606, the Virginia Company was founded, a joint stock company with royal backing, responsible for establishing a colony on the east coast of North America. In 1607, Jamestown was founded, the first permanent English settlement on the continent. Survival was precarious, marked by conflicts with native peoples, famine, and an economy not yet self-sufficient. However, from 1612, with the introduction of tobacco cultivation, the colony began to generate profits, attracting new settlers, investors, and support from London. This gave rise to a mixed model between private enterprise and state control that would be replicated in other territories. In the Caribbean, British colonies took shape starting in the 1620s, beginning with Barbados. There, the sugarcane plantation system, initially based on contracted European labor, rapidly evolved into a large-scale slave regime. In 1655, Jamaica was captured from the Spanish by an expedition commanded by Robert Venables and William Penn. From then on, it became a central node of the Atlantic trade. The Caribbean islands generated enormous profits, especially after the institutionalization of the slave trade from Africa, with London as the financial center of the process. The plantation economy became dominant in that region, and its model would soon be replicated in other areas of the empire. Meanwhile, the African coasts were integrated into English trade routes through enclaves in places like the Gold Coast. The Royal African Company, founded in 1672 with royal support, monopolized the human traffic from West Africa to America. This trade, which included ivory, gold, and slaves, became one of the pillars of the imperial economy. The expeditions not only sought exotic products, but also political alliances with local chiefs, protection contracts, and advantages over Dutch and French competitors. In parallel, new routes were opening in Asia. The East India Company, founded in 1600, established factories in Surat and Madras, penetrating the trade of spices, textiles, and tea. Although its presence was still limited compared to Mughal dominance, it laid the foundations for future expansions. The activity of these private companies was not isolated, but part of a system that combined mercantile logic with geopolitical aspirations. The Virginia Company, the Levant Company, the Royal African Company, and the East India Company acted with a royal charter, allowing them to function as semi-state organs with the power to negotiate, declare war, or impose laws in their areas of operation. This generated a decentralized model where the empire was built from multiple autonomous centers, although all were articulated around London. The Crown maintained a certain formal control, but left the initiative and the risks to private investors. This model reduced costs for the state and increased the speed of expansion. The result was a network of enclaves that combined military, diplomatic, and commercial activity under the English flag. Contact with indigenous peoples was uneven and changing. In North America, the settlers initially depended on the natives for survival, but tensions over land, food, and culture led to wars. In Virginia, massacres and reprisals occurred during the first half of the 17th century, which led to the progressive militarization of the settlement. In the Caribbean, the original peoples were displaced or exterminated, being replaced by enslaved African labor. In Africa, the relationship was more commercial, with alliances with local leaders to guarantee the constant flow of slaves. In Asia, the East India Company sought to integrate into local power structures, offering tributes and respecting hierarchies, at least in its first decades. In all cases, the pattern was strategic adaptation to the local environment with the goal of ensuring profitability and expansion. England was not alone in this process. Scotland also attempted to establish colonies, such as the failed Darien project in Panama, which failed in 1699. Ireland, on the other hand, was treated as an internal colony, used as a starting point for military operations and as a space for English settlement. The relationship between the three nations was not egalitarian. England led the process but incorporated human and financial contributions from its island neighbours. The imperial expansion became a broader British project after the later political union, but in this stage, tensions between the different kingdoms were already perceptible. Religious, economic and social differences marked the distribution of power within the nascent empire, with London at the centre of all important decisions. At the political level, the 17th century was marked by changes that directly impacted colonial administration. The conflict between Parliament and the Crown led to the Civil War, the execution of Charles I, and the establishment of the Commonwealth under Cromwell. During that period, control over the colonies was reinforced, with measures such as the Navigation Act of 1651, which restricted colonial trade to English ships. This law, designed to curb the Dutch, increased the colony's dependence on London. After the restoration of the monarchy, imperial projects were reactivated, and in 1686 the Dominion of New England was created, a centralized administration to more effectively control the colonies of the American Northeast. This measure generated local resistance and became one of the precedents for the rejection of metropolitan control. The closing point of this period came with the Glorious Revolution of 1688 through 1689, when William of Orange assumed the throne after the expulsion of James II. This change not only had internal consequences, but also on the imperial structure. A parliamentary system was consolidated that limited the absolute power of the monarch and favored commercial expansion through laws approved by representatives. Imperial policy became more systematic, with greater planning, strategic objectives, and financial ties. Private companies retained power, but began to depend more on decisions made in Westminster. From then on, the empire would no longer be a dispersed collection of autonomous enclaves, but a structure connected by norms, routes, and shared objectives. Starting in 1689, the British Empire entered a new phase, more centralized, more regulated, and with ambitions that overflowed what was strictly commercial. The era of transatlantic trade. Following the political events of the late 17th century, the British Atlantic colonies began to consolidate as units with more defined economic functions. In North America, the English possessions expanded inland, reinforcing their borders, while in the Caribbean, the islands dedicated to intensive sugarcane cultivation adjusted their social and productive structure according to metropolitan demands. The colonial authorities acted as a gear between local interest and the priorities of Parliament. In some areas, the indigenous assemblymen began to gain influence, although without breaking the framework of imperial control. The Atlantic economy acquired a more defined structure by integrating in a coordinated manner the extraction of raw materials, the export of manufactured goods, and the forced movement of people. This articulation operated among multiple colonial regions and reinforced the central role of the colonies in the empire's economic strategy. The growing volume of exchanges also served as an argument to expand the British naval fleet, guarantee maritime control, and consolidate dominance over the key routes of the Atlantic. The Asiento de Negros granted by Spain to Great Britain after the Utrecht agreements gave the British the right to introduce up to 4,800 slaves per year into Spanish America. Private companies such as the South Atlantic economy acquired a more defined structure by systematically integrating commerce, production, and the forced movement of people between continents. During the 18th century, this model consolidated as the financial and logistical axis of the empire, linking the extraction of colonial raw materials with industry and credit in London. The expansion of these routes served as justification for the strengthening of the British naval fleet and the creation of fiscal mechanisms intended to sustain its control over the seas. C Company administered this privilege under strict state surveillance. This international agreement consolidated the British position in Atlantic trade and strengthened the connection between London's finances and colonial operations. The empire's fiscal structure began to adapt to the challenges of the new century. To sustain naval operations and intercolonial wars, the British government created more complex collection mechanisms in the colonies. Specific taxes were imposed on key products in some regions. Taxation not only responded to economic ends, but also served to reinforce metropolitan authority. In the 13 colonies, the tension between local governments and the Crown's delegates increased when tax measures began to be perceived as interference with regional autonomy. However, no break occurred. The imperial apparatus maintained its formal dominance without major fractures. British maritime trade experienced sustained growth, supported by naval policies designed to ensure superiority on ocean routes. The navigation laws approved by Parliament stipulated which goods had to be transported on British ships and with English crew. This legal framework strengthened state control over mercantile activities, limiting foreign competition in the colonial territories. In exchange, the colonists obtained a certain military protection, which reinforced loyalty towards the metropolis in contexts of conflict. The 18th century was marked by military confrontations between colonial powers. The War of the Asiento, which began in 1739, pitted Great Britain and Spain against each other for control of routes and commercial concessions. This conflict, also known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, allowed the British to launch naval operations in the Caribbean, especially against positions in Cartagena and Havana. The capacity to mobilize troops from North America was put to the test, revealing logistical failures and dependence on naval support. Although the results were mixed, the experience allowed strategies to be adjusted for future confrontations. In parallel, territorial disputes in North America escalated between British and French colonists. Competition to control the interior of the continent led to recurring clashes in the Ohio Valley areas and the Upper Canada regions. These tensions culminated in a major conflict known as the 7 Years' War. Starting in 1756, this war had a global scope, but its most notorious consequences occurred in the overseas domains. In North America, British troops advanced on key French strongholds like Louisbourg and Quebec. In India, East India Company forces participated in operations against French enclaves with the backing of the Royal Navy. The conflict tested the administrative and military capacity of the British Empire. Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder reorganized the imperial war effort, prioritizing resources for overseas campaigns. Local commands received logistical support from London, and colonial authorities were obliged to contribute men and supplies. The result was a decisive victory that culminated with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Great Britain gained control of Canada, several Caribbean islands, and key territories in India. The structure of the empire changed. It ceased to be a dispersed network of enclaves and acquired a more integrated form, sustained by naval dominance. The growth of the British naval apparatus during this stage was one of the pillars of the imperial project. The Royal Navy increased the number of ships of the line and improved provisioning systems. New shipyards were built, and administrative reforms were applied to ensure the fleet's operation. This investment allowed strategic bases to be established in Atlantic ports, facilitating the projection of power in areas such as the Gulf of Mexico, the West African coast, or the Caribbean Sea. British naval superiority not only defended commercial routes, but also acted as an instrument of diplomatic negotiation in international scenarios. The role of the Caribbean colonies was reinforced through legal and administrative adjustments. Local councils were introduced in Jamaica and Barbados under metropolitan surveillance, which allowed London to exert control without the need for constant presence. Local landowners participated in decisions about taxes, militias, and trade regulations, although governors continued to be appointed by the Crown. This unstable balance worked as long as local interests coincided with imperial objectives. When tensions arose, British authorities intervened with restrictive measures. The sugar economy generated great profits for the financial and commercial sectors of London and Bristol. English investors channeled capital toward plantations, refineries, and distribution networks. The link between slavery, agricultural production, and export became one of the engines of imperial accumulation. Marine insurance, loan houses, and banks benefited from the constant traffic between producing islands and European ports. The volume of goods transported grew steadily between 1700 and 1760, which consolidated the idea that the colonies were essential for national prosperity. In parallel, the North American colonies experienced a demographic increase. The arrival of British, Irish, Scottish, and other European migrants expanded the size and diversity of the colonial communities. Port cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia grew in economic importance. Printing presses, craft workshops, trade centers, and local assemblies with a certain decision-making capacity emerged. Although the final power still resided in London, local structures showed signs of institutional maturation. Political life in the colonies became more complex, with debates between regional elites and royal officials. The balance between centralization and autonomy was a constant in this phase. The colonies accepted British sovereignty as long as no excessive intrusion was perceived. The wars served as a catalyst to strengthen imperial ties, but also revealed fissures. The obligation to finance conflicts generated resistance in some colonial sectors. Although no formal break was proposed, discourses began to emerge that questioned certain decisions of Parliament. These tensions were not yet dominant, but anticipated dynamics that would gain strength in later decades. Upon concluding the 7 Years' War, Great Britain had notably expanded its empire. The victory over France granted it new territories and confirmed its naval hegemony. However, the financial cost of the conflict forced a review of fiscal and administrative policies. The imperial administration had to decide how to govern its domains without losing efficiency or causing discontent. The decisions made at this juncture would mark the course of the empire during the second half of the 18th century. From America to Asia and the Pacific, the British territorial shift. The measures introduced after the end of the 7 Years' War altered the balance between the metropolis and its North American possessions. In 1763, the British government imposed new commercial and fiscal restrictions that sought to increase the Treasury's revenue through greater contributions from the colonies. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act became the symbol of the change in the relationship between London and its overseas subjects. Colonial authorities, accustomed to a significant degree of autonomy, rejected the direct intervention of the British Parliament in fiscal matters, especially in the absence of elected representatives. The following years saw growing tension over the issue of political representation. Protests in Boston and other port cities led to boycotts, riots, and attacks against tax agents. The violence reached a critical point with the clashes of 1770 and 1773, including the destruction of tea in Boston Harbor. Parliament responded with punitive laws that sought to reaffirm imperial authority, but only deepened the discontent. In 1775, armed conflict broke out in Lexington and Concord, marking the beginning of open war between the rebellious colonies and the Crown. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 formalized the break. 13 colonies proclaimed the creation of a new nation, and British forces faced organized resistance backed by European powers such as France and Spain. The prolongation of the conflict wore down British military and economic resources. After the surrender at Yorktown in 1781, negotiations led to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially recognized American independence and forced Great Britain to redefine its imperial policy. The impact of the defeat was profound. Instead of a general withdrawal, the London government promoted a structural reorganization of the remaining empire. Canada, the Caribbean, and the Asian colonies acquired a new centrality in the imperial strategy. A more professional administration was promoted, with officials who had to respond to precise directives from the metropolis. The loss of North America also reinforced interest in Asia and the Pacific, where investments and commercial expeditions increased. In India, the East India Company reinforced its political role after the collapse of Mughal control. The British Parliament approved the India Act in 1784, establishing official supervision over the company's operations. This marked the beginning of a transformation that would lead to the direct domination of the subcontinent. Military expansion in the region accelerated, accompanied by a civil administration influenced by metropolitan models. The reforms also reached the judicial system with the introduction of British norms that replaced local laws. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, British interests focused on securing strategic points. Expeditions led by James Cook had identified new routes and territories. Starting in 1788, permanent settlements were established in New South Wales, which allowed the development of a network of small colonies that facilitated navigation and trade between Asia and South America. The region became part of a broader strategy of British presence in the ocean. During that same period, the empire became involved in the conflicts derived from the French Revolution. From 1793, Great Britain actively participated in wars against revolutionary France and later against Napoleon. These wars transformed the imperial economy, increased fiscal pressure, and led to a sustained militarization of the key colonies. The Royal Navy became the main instrument of global power, controlling sea routes and preventing French expansion overseas. In the Caribbean, slave rebellions and struggles between European powers caused the region to experience constant instability. Sugar plantations, the economic pillar of many islands, faced labor shortages, attacks, and blockades. The revolution in Haiti had a domino effect, inspiring fear in local elites and motivating stricter vigilance. Despite this, British control over the islands survived, with military reinforcements and containment measures. In North America, after American independence, the British authorities strengthened the government in Canada. New administrative structures were established to ensure the population's loyalty and avoid any revolutionary contagion. Immigration of loyalists to the empire from the former colonies reinforced the British identity in the region. In parallel, treaties were established with indigenous peoples to avoid clashes and secure safe trade routes inland. The military campaigns in Europe and the Mediterranean influenced the distribution of imperial resources. Troops assigned to protect the continent often came from the colonies, and many colonial officers gained experience on those fronts. At the same time, the British presence in southern Africa was strengthened with the occupation of the Cape in 1795, initially to prevent its control by the French, and then as a strategic enclave on the route to Asia. The conflict with Napoleon led to the development of new alliances. Great Britain signed agreements with powers such as Russia, Austria, and Prussia, which allowed it to concentrate its efforts on the sea and in the colonial territories. British naval dominance was key in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, which consolidated its maritime supremacy and ensured the provisioning of the colonies. During this time, fiscal and administrative reforms were promoted to sustain the prolonged war effort. Upon the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the British Empire emerged strengthened in territorial and strategic terms. Although it had lost its colonies on the Atlantic coast of North America, it had managed to expand its influence in Asia, Oceania, and Africa. The experience of the war promoted a more centralized and controlled vision of imperial power based on a combination of military force, bureaucratic management, and maritime superiority. With these changes, the imperial system acquired a more coherent structure. Trade, administration, and defense began to function with greater coordination among the different regions. An imperial network was consolidated that would allow Great Britain to exert global influence during the 19th century, marked by a logic of constant expansion, economic control, and naval dominance. From India to the new white colonies. During the 19th century, British control over India was reorganized under parliamentary supervision, while the East India Company continued to execute operational decisions from the metropolis. The Governor-General, assisted by a legislative council, administered the territories directly subordinate to the Crown without intervening in the states of the Allied princes. From London, legal reforms were promoted aimed at unifying judicial criteria and standardizing civil and criminal procedures. The objective was to create a more homogeneous institutional structure in all regions under British rule. Simultaneously, religious missions expanded their presence, reinforced by legal authorization to preach and found Christian schools. This cultural offensive coincided with the expansion of transport and communication infrastructure, led by both public and private investment. The railway, in particular, altered the Indian economic geography and facilitated greater mobility of the colonial army. Along with the railway lines, telegraph networks were laid that connected key cities with Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. Hydraulic works were extended through the Indus and Ganges territories, increasing agricultural production through canals that diverted large volumes of water to previously dry areas. The tension between the desire for institutional uniformity and the ethnic and religious reality of the local population remained constant. Sporadic uprisings such as the Barakpur and Vellore disturbances exposed the fragility of native military loyalty in the face of reforms imposed from outside. Despite the subsequent apparent stability, dissatisfaction grew silently in numerous subordinate sectors. Metropolitan elites began to debate more strongly about the future of domination in Asia, especially after the consolidation of alternative trade routes to China. In Africa, British incursions focused on strategic areas like the Cape, Sierra Leone, and the West Coast. Colonial authorities attempted to consolidate their influence through treaties with local leaders, the creation of protectorates, and the occupation of coastal enclaves. The policy applied combined diplomatic agreements with military interventions when tribal resistance complicated British plans. Campaigns in the Niger region and the Gulf of Benin were accompanied by reports that highlighted the economic importance of those territories for their agricultural resources, valuable timber, and accessible labor. As the century progressed, the naval presence intensified, and permanent administrative posts were installed, with the backing of the Admiralty and London merchants interested in tropical exports. In Asia, British control over peripheral territories was reinforced through commercial concession and military protection agreements. In Burma, hostilities with the Ava Kingdom led to progressive annexations after brief but decisive conflicts. The advance northward met resistance in mountainous areas, although the British technological and organizational advantage allowed key positions to be consolidated. In Hong Kong and its surroundings, dominance was secured thanks to treaties signed with the Qing court after conflicts linked to the opium trade and the forced opening of ports for international trade. During this period, British migration to the white settler colonies reached unprecedented levels. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, thousands of families moved in search of better opportunities. British legislation favoured this movement with transport aid and land grants. In parallel, colonial authorities facilitated the incorporation of the newcomers through laws that recognized their civil rights, provided they swore loyalty to the Crown. The new cities created in these territories replicated British architectural and administrative models. Churches, schools, and courts operated under the same principles as in London, while local parliaments adopted representative structures similar to those in Westminster, although limited by the authority of the governor appointed by the central government. The empire's economic growth during these decades was supported by the expansion of trade networks, access to abundant raw materials, and the development of industrial infrastructure in the metropolis. Investments in railways, mines, and plantations were stimulated by companies with banking backing in the city. The expansion of insurance and shipping companies allowed the frequency of routes between imperial ports to be increased. The pound sterling was consolidated as the reference currency in international exchanges, and London became the financial centre for imperial operations. The export of machinery, textiles and chemical products from British factories remained constant, while the colonies sent cotton, tea, sugar, gold and tin. The institutional structure of the empire acquired greater complexity, partly due to the need to coordinate decisions between different levels of power. The colonial office, led by specialized officials, supervised the administrative network overseas. Reports sent from colonial governments were analyzed in London by specific committees, which then recommended tailored measures for each case. Communication between viceroys, governors and parliament became more fluid thanks to the telegraph and the systematization of archives. The control model was not uniform. Some territories had their own parliaments, others were governed directly, and in certain cases, local monarchies were maintained under British supervision. The ideological justification for the dominance was increasingly articulated around the notion of moral duty. The idea was promoted that the empire had the responsibility to raise the level of civilization in the subjected regions. This perspective was translated into official discourses, school texts, religious sermons, and parliamentary directives. Universal exhibitions organized in London presented the empire as a harmonious network of peoples connected by British guidance. Military academies, universities, and settler associations repeated this narrative, while the press reinforced the image of an inevitable civilizing project. Disputes over dominance, resistances, and rearrangements. The incorporation of the Egyptian territory into British control was not executed by direct means from the beginning. Although the military occupation began in 1882, the local administrative apparatus formally remained intact. However, the real decisions progressively shifted to British officials. Evelyn Baring, appointed as Consul General, led the economic reforms starting in 1883, using the Egyptian state apparatus to adjust finances, rationalize income, and limit expenditures. The existing institutions were preserved to avoid abrupt clashes, although subordinated to the priorities of the British Treasury. In the south of the African continent, the presence of the United Kingdom intensified after the incorporation of Natal and the Cape in the mid-19th century. Conflicts with African communities such as the Zulu and with Boer republics like the Transvaal altered the regional balance. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in the 1870s accelerated the rivalry. The conflict with the Boer culminated in the First Anglo-Boer War of 1880 through 1881, when the empire attempted to reaffirm its dominance in the Transvaal. Despite an initial British victory, subsequent agreements returned some autonomy, although without fully recognizing the territory's independence. The second phase of intervention in South Africa unfolded with a more determined focus. Cecil Rhodes promoted an expansive strategy from the Cape, backing the control of trade routes to the north and encouraging annexations in Bechuanaland and Mashonaland. This advance was consolidated with the founding of Rhodesia, named in his honor. The Second Anglo-Boer War, 1899 through 1902, erupted due to the resistance of the Orange and Transvaal republics, which opposed British supremacy. The military campaign was long and costly, with prolonged fighting, the use of concentration camps, and systematic repression. The final victory led to the integration of both territories within the imperial administration. In other regions of the Pacific, the imperial strategy also responded to economic and logistical objectives. Fiji was proclaimed a colony in 1874, following the request to cede sovereignty by King Kakobau. The reasons included pressure from British settlers, growing debts, and the need for a stable legal framework. At the same time, the presence in Australia and New Zealand was reinforced through agreements with indigenous leaders and colonization policies. In New Zealand, the Maori War of the 1860s left the British authorities with effective control over the islands, although they faced intermittent resistance in later decades. The imperial scenario was also marked by internal tensions at different points of the domain. In India, the reforms initiated after the rebellion of 1857 remained active during the last third of the 19th century. Education in English was promoted, bureaucratic bodies were consolidated, and attempts were made to attract local collaborators. However, the emergence of the Indian National Congress in 1885 marked a turning point. This body channeled demands for participation and expressed criticism against fiscal decisions, lack of access to high-ranking positions, and agrarian policies. In Ireland, the campaigns for autonomy led by Charles Stewart Parnell gained strength in the 1880s, pushing the Gladstone governments to present Home Rule proposals. Although they were not approved in that period, they reflected the discomfort with the centralized model. The case of West Africa also showed challenges to imperial power. In the Niger River region, British companies extended trade networks, driven by interest in palm oil and other products. The Royal Niger Company obtained a royal charter in 1886, operating with quasi-state attributes. However, the resistance of local communities, along with conflicts with European powers such as France and Germany, led to more direct intervention. By 1900, the area was restructured as a protectorate under the formal control of the colonial administration. In parallel, nationalisms within the colonies adopted diverse expressions. In Egypt, the figure of Ahmed Urabi led a revolt in 1881 through 1882 that questioned British dominance and the local elite. Although he was defeated and exiled, he left a precedent of opposition articulated with sectors of the army and officials. In India, voices like those of Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale began to denounce the extraction of resources and imbalances in trade. In Ireland, in addition to parliamentary campaigns, direct action movements such as the Irish Republican Brotherhood emerged. Manifestations of nationalism were also perceived in other regions. In Burma, after the annexation of 1885, British authorities faced years of armed rebellions in rural areas. In East Africa, the imposition of colonial control over territories such as Kenya or Uganda generated pockets of resistance, especially when authorities imposed forced labor, land restrictions, and commercial monopolies. These responses varied in intensity and form, but they had in common the rejection of structures imposed without consultation or representation. Meanwhile, within the United Kingdom itself, an imperial narrative took hold that fueled national identity. The expansion of the empire was presented as a civilizing duty, promoted by public discourses, school textbooks, and patriotic celebrations. Institutions like the army, the Anglican Church, and the colonial administration were shown as vehicles of progress. Events such as the Imperial Exhibition of 1886 or Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 reinforced this imaginary, highlighting the diversity of peoples under the Crown and exalting the role of London as a global command centre. Visual and editorial culture also reinforced this perception. Illustrated publications such as The Graphic or Illustrated London News presented images of military campaigns, exotic scenes, and portraits of governors. In literature, authors like Rudyard Kipling contributed to spreading imperial values with stories set in the colonies. At the same time, maps, statistics, and chronicles were circulated in metropolitan clubs and societies that shaped a shared imperial consciousness among different social sectors. This framework of dominance, opposition, and symbolic construction defined the final decades of the 19th century. Although the control mechanisms were varied, and the responses from the colonies were not always able to alter them immediately, a scenario was outlined where imperial power no longer operated without friction. The tensions accumulated in this period, visible on multiple fronts, would be the ones that would set the tone for the next century. War and transformation, the empire between global conflicts. In August of 1914, the British authorities announced to the rest of the world that the empire had officially entered a state of war. With this declaration, all colonial possessions and dominions became involved in the conflict. At the moment the United Kingdom formalized its war commitment, the territories controlled by the Crown on 5 continents were considered an active part of the military effort. The situation implied both the mobilization of material and human resources, which included the deployment of colonial troops on European fronts, and the organization of campaigns in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. From Canada to New Zealand, passing through India, Nigeria, and South Africa, the entire empire became a constant source of supplies, soldiers, and logistical support. The figures recorded by military offices show that India recruited more than 1 million personnel during the conflict. There were also relevant contributions from British West Africa, whose battalions were sent to fight in regions such as German Cameroon or East Africa. Colonial authorities managed recruitment through alliances with local chiefs, although in many cases coercive forms were also resorted to. In the Pacific, Australian and New Zealander forces occupied former German enclaves, expanding British territorial control. Although the war reaffirmed the links between the different possessions of the empire, it also revealed political and social fissures that would gain greater prominence in the post-war period. On the home front, the impact of the conflict on the metropolis was considerable. Human losses and the economic cost generated an atmosphere of questioning the continuity of the imperial model. However, the colonies maintained their participation until the armistice of 1918. At the end of the war, the Paris Peace Conference granted the United Kingdom new mandates over former Ottoman and German territories, which further expanded the geographical scope of the empire. The Versailles Agreements recognized Great Britain as the mandatory power in key regions such as Palestine, Iraq, Tanganyika and Cameroon, which added complexity to the colonial system. Despite the new acquisitions, political elites in London began to perceive that control over such an extensive network required reforms. In parallel, the White Dominions began to demand a more autonomous position in imperial decision-making. During the 1920s, the relationship between the central government and the Dominions experienced an institutional shift. In 1926, the Imperial Conference of London recognized the equality of status between the United Kingdom and the Dominions, such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. This principle was embodied in the Statute of Westminster of 1931, which legally established that British laws would not apply in the Dominions without their consent. This redefinition formalized a new model of association within the Commonwealth. Ireland, however, followed a different path. After the Easter Rising of 1916 and the subsequent War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in 1921. This gave way to the creation of the Irish Free State, with a status comparable to that of the Dominions, but with a tense political situation due to the British partition in the territorial division of the island. Northern Ireland remained under British jurisdiction, consolidating an internal separation that would remain for the rest of the century. In other regions of the empire, the consequences of the conflict and the constitutional reforms stimulated demands for greater autonomy. In India, the promise of gradual self-government contained in the Montagu-Chelmsford Declaration of 1917 led to the Government of India Act of 1919. This regulation established a dual system of administration in the provinces, known as diarchy, which combined imperial authorities and Indian representatives in governmental functions. Although the scheme granted limited powers, it was interpreted as a first step towards local political participation. Nevertheless, frustration over the restricted scope of these reforms led to an increase in nationalist mobilization. Under the leadership of figures like Gandhi, civil disobedience campaigns were initiated that challenged the legitimacy of British rule. The non-cooperation movement, the protest against the salt tax, and other massive actions marked a period of constant confrontation between colonial authorities and independent sectors. In Africa, the interwar period was also marked by administrative reorganization and the growth of indirect rule structures. Colonial governors like Frederick Lugard in Nigeria promoted systems that incorporated traditional hierarchies under British supervision. In parallel, social movements and cultural associations emerged that questioned the inequity of the colonial order. The implementation of taxes, labor exploitation, and institutional segregation fueled protests in various African colonies. During the 1930s, the empire faced the impact of the global economic crisis. The collapse of export prices seriously affected colonial economies, which intensified social tensions. At the same time, the British Parliament approved new laws aimed at regulating imperial trade through systems of tariff preference, seeking to strengthen economic ties between the metropolis and its territories. During these years, imperial defense was restructured. Based on the experience accumulated in the Great War, new forms of military cooperation with the Dominions were promoted. In 1932, a specialized conference addressed strategic issues such as possible threats in Asia and the need to secure trade routes through a permanent maritime presence. However, differences in interests and capabilities between the different parts of the empire made it difficult to develop a truly coordinated strategy. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 reactivated the integration of the imperial system. The Dominions declared war on Germany with a certain delay compared to the United Kingdom, but ended up becoming fully involved in the conflict. Troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and India participated in war theatres as diverse as North Africa, Europe, the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia. The British government, through the Ministry of Information, coordinated propaganda campaigns aimed at highlighting the unity of the empire against the Axis threat. At the same time, intelligence services such as MI5 and the SOE operated in colonial territories to ensure the loyalty of local populations and counteract enemy infiltration. Military bases were also established in strategic colonies to facilitate Allied operations. During the conflict, India became a key logistical pillar. It housed military facilities, supply routes to China, and Southeast Asian fronts. Despite this, the independence movement intensified its pressure. In 1942, the Indian National Congress launched the Quit India campaign, demanding the immediate departure of the British. The Viceroy's response was to arrest the main leaders, which caused a wave of disturbances. Meanwhile, in Africa, thousands of soldiers were recruited to fight under the British flag, and bases in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya and South Africa were used for training and logistical support. At the end of the war, many of these combatants returned with new political aspirations, driving anti-colonial movements in their countries of origin. The war experience accelerated the structural transformations of the empire. The metropolis, weakened by the military effort and with an exhausted economy, lacked the resources to sustain the imperial apparatus in its previous form. In 1945, the New World scenario, marked by the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union, placed Great Britain before the dilemma of redefining its international role. At the end of the conflict, official reports prepared by the Colonial Office recognized the need to promote profound reforms. The extension of self-government in priority colonies and the creation of representative structures in other regions were proposed. The strategy aimed to preserve economic and diplomatic ties through a controlled transition toward new forms of post-colonial association. That period marked the beginning of a stage in which the empire moved away from its classical configuration to enter a process of gradual dissolution. The initiatives of the Commonwealth, the planning of independence for India, and the emergence of local leaderships across the African continent indicated that the previous model could no longer be sustained. The decisions made between 1914 and 1945 determined the final trajectory of British domination in the 20th century. The final agreements, transitions and ruptures of power. In 1947, Viceroy Lord Mountbatten oversaw the separation of the territory into two independent states. This division provoked massive migrations and violent episodes, with Punjab and Bengal as epicenters of forced displacements. The new Indian National Congress government accepted the partition, while the Muslim League promoted the creation of Pakistan as a sovereign nation. In parallel, Ceylon and Burma also achieved complete autonomy shortly thereafter, thus formalizing the dismantling of British control over South Asia. In Africa, the withdrawal of the United Kingdom was more gradual. The Gold Coast, following political reforms that included the election of local assemblies, achieved its independence as Ghana in 1957 under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. Nigeria followed in 1960 after a process of federalization that reorganized its regions under a negotiated constitution. In East Africa, Tanganyika obtained its sovereignty in 1961 after years of legislative reforms. Kenya faced a more violent path with the Mau Mau rebellion in the 1950s, to which London responded with a prolonged military campaign and the arrest of leaders like Jomo Kenyatta. Despite this, Kenya became an independent republic in 1963. Decolonization also advanced in the Caribbean region. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago separated from the United Kingdom in 1962. Subsequently, other Caribbean territories gained their independence throughout the following decades. In parallel, the plan to form a Federation of the West Indies failed due to internal divisions and a lack of consensus on its political and economic structure. The Suez Canal, controlled by the British since the 19th century, became the epicenter of a serious international crisis in 1956. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the waterway, London reacted in alliance with France and Israel, carrying out a military intervention without the backing of Washington. The operation generated immediate international condemnation. The United States pressured with economic and financial measures that forced the withdrawal of British troops. This episode demonstrated the decline of imperial power and marked a turning point in the foreign policy of the United Kingdom. During the following decades, the process of decolonization was influenced by local armed resistance, prolonged negotiations, and international pressure. In Malaya, the Communist Party uprising led to the declaration of a state of emergency in 1948. The conflict lasted 12 years and was tackled through a combined military strategy with social reforms. In 1957, Malaya achieved independence with a multi-party political system. In Kenya, in addition to the Mau Mau uprising, the process included the establishment of constitutional commissions, rounds of talks between African delegations and colonial authorities, and the gradual move towards self-government with African participation in legislative bodies. Independence was consolidated after a three-phase process which included legal reforms, elections, and the transfer of executive power. In Cyprus, the situation led to a prolonged conflict. The Ioka group led a campaign of violence between 1955 and 1959. The goal was the union of the island with Greece, which generated tensions with the Turkish Cypriot population. The Zurich and London agreements established a compromise between the parties and led to the creation of an independent republic in 1960, with formal guarantees for both communities. The colonial administration also faced challenges in southern Rhodesia, where the white government led by Ian Smith declared unilateral independence in 1965. This action was not internationally recognized and provoked a wave of sanctions. The armed confrontation between security forces and the ZANU and ZAPU guerrilla movements lasted for years. The transition concluded with the Lancaster House Agreements in 1979, which established supervised elections and allowed the founding of Zimbabwe as a sovereign state. In West Africa, Sierra Leone and Gambia completed their independence process in 1961 and 1965, respectively. The British authorities facilitated the creation of their own administrative structures before formally relinquishing power. Meanwhile, British Cameroon held a plebiscite in 1961 that led to its partial integration with Francophone Cameroon. In Uganda, after conflicts between the colonial government and traditional kingdoms, a federal constitution was formed. Idi Amin took power through a coup d'état in 1971, which deteriorated the country's stability. In the case of Zambia and Malawi, formerly part of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, independence was achieved through political consultations and the dissolution of the forced union. Kenneth Kaunda assumed the leadership in Zambia and Hastings Banda in Malawi, both under presidential schemes. The decolonization process also extended to island territories. Fiji, with a population divided between indigenous people and descendants of Indian workers, gained independence in 1970 after institutional reforms. The Solomon Islands and Tuvalu followed in 1978, and Kiribati the following year. In each case, the transition was organized under constitutional frameworks adapted to local conditions. In the Middle East, the British withdrawal from Palestine in 1948 gave way to the Arab-Israeli conflict, while in the Persian Gulf, the United Kingdom maintained a military presence until 1971. Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates signed treaties with London to coordinate the departure of British forces. Following those negotiations, each one proclaimed its independence in that same year. Sudan, administered jointly with Egypt since the end of the 19th century, gained its independence in 1956. The region faced internal divisions from the beginning, with tensions between the Arab North and the African South. The British authorities facilitated a process of self-determination that culminated in supervised elections and the end of foreign tutelage. In Oman, although a formal independence did not occur, British intervention progressively reduced starting in the 1960s. British forces supported Sultan Qaboos bin Said in his rise to power in 1970, which allowed for the consolidation of a regime allied with London without direct domination. The inherited colonial structures generated internal tensions in several newly formed countries. In some cases, the borders imposed by the imperial demarcation led to conflicts between communities or with neighbouring states. The British authorities, although no longer in direct control, maintained ties through the Commonwealth, bilateral agreements, and military or economic cooperation programs. In the 1970s, the last colonies with significant populations, such as Hong Kong, Gibraltar, and the Falkland Islands, remained under British sovereignty. In those territories, London retained diplomatic, military, and administrative functions. However, the principle of self-determination was formally incorporated into British foreign policy, starting from official documents such as the White Paper on Dependent Territories. The British government managed the end of its empire through a combination of institutional reforms, bilateral negotiations, and strategic concessions. In all cases, the withdrawal was presented as an orderly process, based on mutual agreements and previously defined constitutional frameworks. The decisions on the pace of each independence varied according to the local context. In territories with active armed movements such as Malaya or Rhodesia, the process was slower and conditioned by security. In regions where an organized political class existed, as in Ghana or India, the transfer of power was more structured and rapid. Some African and Asian leaders participated directly in the negotiations with the British authorities. The London, Lancaster House and Zurich conferences brought together colonial and metropolitan representatives in successive rounds to define transition frameworks. These meetings allowed for the creation of new constitutions, the recognition of local political parties, and the definition of future relations with the United Kingdom. British military presence progressively decreased, with base closures, troop repatriation, and the reduction of defence agreements. In parallel, diplomatic and commercial mechanisms were strengthened through the establishment of embassies, bilateral treaties, and membership in international organisations. The British decolonization process was neither uniform nor free of conflicts. However, between 1947 and 1980, the United Kingdom went from being an imperial power with a presence on 5 continents to becoming a post-colonial state with influence limited through the Commonwealth and its diplomatic networks. The legacy of the empire persisted in the political structures, official languages, and economic relations of the new states. From control to memory, the United Kingdom facing its colonial past. The imperial transition had its formal closure when in 1980, Zimbabwe obtained official recognition as an independent state. This episode marked the last act of British withdrawal from colonial Africa and symbolized the end of direct control over vast territories. Since then, the international role of the United Kingdom began to focus on maintaining bilateral relations, strategic agreements, and diplomatic alliances without colonial power structures. The tensions that arose during the independence process of southern Rhodesia revealed the internal difficulties of that transition. The British government, pressured by the internal situation in Salisbury and by the divisions within the Commonwealth itself, was forced to intervene in the negotiations that led to the signing of the Lancaster House Agreement. This treaty laid the legal foundations for the independence of Zimbabwe, but it also evidenced the loss of British capacity to impose unilateral solutions in the former colonies. The role of regional powers, along with international pressure and the influence of non-state actors, shaped a scenario in which London was no longer the centre of decision. The agreement signed in 1984 between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping established that the territory would return to Chinese control under the principle of one country, two systems. The British administration prepared the handover for more than a decade, managing economic, social and legal matters to maintain stability until the change of sovereignty. The handover ceremony, held in the presence of the Prince of Wales and high-ranking Chinese officials, was carefully organized to convey an image of order and shared responsibility. During the decades following decolonization, the United Kingdom adjusted its foreign relations to adapt to its new status. Imperial institutions were replaced by bilateral or multilateral agreements, and many of the informal networks inherited from the colonial period continued to function, albeit in different forms. The legal, linguistic, and administrative structures implanted by the metropolis continued to influence the states that had been part of the empire, generating forms of symbolic, economic, or institutional dependence. In many cases, the old ties were expressed through defense treaties, educational cooperation, or financial support. One of the most visible effects of the post-imperial stage was the growth of immigration to the United Kingdom from the former colonial territories. The arrival of populations from the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia transformed the social composition of the country. Although the British government adopted measures to limit migratory flows starting in the 1960s, the process continued during the 1980s and 1990s, generating a new multicultural reality. The children and grandchildren of those who had been born in the colonies became part of British society, with growing participation in politics, culture, and the economy. Tensions between the official narrative of the civilizing empire and the experiences lived by those who had been colonized led to a critical review of the imperial legacy. Civil society organizations, historians, and activists demanded recognition of the abuses committed during colonial rule and called for a more faithful representation of the facts in education, museums, and official discourses. In parallel, some political and media sectors defended a nostalgic vision of the imperial past. Idealized images of the empire were promoted as a symbol of stability, order, and national greatness. This rhetoric was used to reinforce certain positions on cultural belonging, the role of the United Kingdom in the world, and the need to preserve traditional values in the face of demographic and social changes. Official commemorations, public monuments, and educational programs became fields of symbolic dispute between opposing visions of the imperial legacy. The evolution of the Commonwealth during this period reflects the ambiguities of British post-imperialism. Although formally unlinked from the colonial past, the organization retained elements that evoked shared history. The figure of the British monarch as the symbolic head of the Commonwealth generated discussions about the current meaning of the institution. Some member states questioned the relevance of maintaining this ceremonial link, while others interpreted it as an expression of respectful continuity. The biannual meetings of heads of government served as a platform to address global issues, from sustainable development to cooperation in health and education. The United Kingdom's participation in these initiatives was framed within a foreign policy that sought to balance economic interests, historical commitments, and strategic priorities. Former African colonies received financial support through the Commonwealth Development Fund, and preferential trade agreements were signed with several Caribbean and Pacific countries. However, these actions were often criticized for their limited scope or for conditioning aid on political reforms aligned with British interests. In some cases, the tensions derived from these relationships led to the temporary suspension of certain Commonwealth states. Internally, the memory of the empire was managed unequally. While some academic institutions promoted critical research on the colonial past, others maintained more conventional versions. Media and cultural representations also offered divergent approaches. Films, documentaries, and novels recreated episodes of the empire from perspectives ranging from celebration to condemnation. This plurality of views reflected the existing fractures in British society regarding its historical heritage. The imperial legacy became a central element of the debate on national identity in a context of demographic transformation, geopolitical changes, and economic challenges. Public education gradually incorporated content on the empire, but the treatment of these topics varied according to regions, school programs, and political orientations. In some cases, specific units were included on the transatlantic slave trade, the colonization of India, or the wars of independence in Africa. In others, the content was presented superficially or biasedly. This situation generated demands for more comprehensive teaching, which included the voices of the colonized peoples and the analysis of the power structures that sustained British rule. During the 1990s, various social movements launched campaigns to remove statues, change street names, and revise tributes linked to figures of the empire. These initiatives met resistance among those who considered that such actions threatened cultural heritage or promoted a negative vision of national history. Discussions about historical reparation, official apologies, and the restitution of cultural goods intensified in this context. The British government responded cautiously, avoiding forceful positions, although some local authorities adopted symbolic measures. The return of Hong Kong and the consolidation of the Commonwealth as a post-imperial multilateral framework coincided with a period of strategic redefinition. The United Kingdom, which had been an imperial power for centuries, came to play an intermediate role between Europe, the Atlantic world, and its former colonies. This ambiguous position generated tensions in the formulation of foreign policies, especially in relation to the European Union, the United States, and the countries of the Global South. British post-imperialism was characterized by this combination of persistent ties, institutional adaptations, and symbolic disputes. At the end of the 20th century, the debate on the imperial legacy remained open. Immigration policies, racial conflicts, the teaching of history, and foreign policy were crossed by opposing interpretations of the past. The empire no longer existed as a political structure, but it continued to exert influence on the present. The colonial experience left traces in diplomatic relations, national identities, and internal inequalities. The memory of the empire operated as a field of dispute, in which social projects and cultural visions about the United Kingdom's place in the contemporary world clashed.